Welcome to the second of three talks in the series on the subject of exile and displacement, World War II, and the transformation of the Western art world. The subject of tonight's talk is New Audiences for Modern German Art, and it's presented by Jenny McComas, the Eskenazi Museum of Art's curator of European and American art, and the head of the museum's World War II era provenance research project. We hope that you'll be able to join us next week for the third and final talk in this series. And in case you did miss any of the live programs, we are recording all three, as I mentioned, and we'll have those all available for you at the end of the month. If you have registered for this talk, you will receive those recordings in an email. We'll also have them available on our website. So with that, again, I want to remind folks to use the chat feature to connect with us. And I will invite Jenny in to get us started today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the museum's series of talks on the subject of exile and displacement, World War II, and the transformation of the Western art world. Before I get started, I would like to again extend my sincere gratitude to my colleagues, Erin Ryan and Laura Shepper, who have been so instrumental in helping with the technical aspects of our Zoom presentations. I also want to extend a thank you and a welcome to those of you who are joining for the second time, who came to the talk last week, and also welcome to those who are joining for the first time tonight. As Erin said, you can always catch up later in the month with our recordings. So in this series, we are looking at several lesser known facets of World War II era provenance issues. If you attended last week's talk, you heard about the means by which several Jewish collectors managed to prevent the Nazis from confiscating their art collections. Tonight, we'll turn our attention to the Third Reich's campaign against modern art, the so-called Degenerate Art Campaign. So the role of modernism within Nazi ideology could fill an entire talk itself. And while I will outline its main characteristics, I'll primarily be discussing the broader consequences of the Nazi defamation of modern art and artists, namely the resultant creation of new audiences and new interpretations of German modernism abroad. This is a huge and multifaceted topic, and in fact, it was a subject of my 300-page doctoral dissertation. So tonight, I will not subject you to that level of detail, but we will examine some of the nuances and consequences of Nazi anti-modernism that are not often discussed, either in the literature or in exhibitions or presentations intended for the more general public. We will be looking at the case study of one artist who went into exile, and we'll also look at how different Allied countries responded to Germany's disposal of numerous works of art from its own museums. In short, we'll consider how politics can influence artistic taste. Whenever possible, I've brought in examples from the Eskenazi Museum's own collection, but we'll also be looking at a much wider range of visuals tonight. And Erin, I am having trouble advancing my slide.
Click on the screen. It just needs to recognize that you're on Zoom.
So.
If you click on the screen slide, is that working?
Oh yes, there we go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So in the photograph here at the left of the screen from the Berlin National Gallery, taken circa 1930, we see a gallery filled with paintings by the German expressionist artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Kirchner was one of the central figures in the German expressionist group known as Die Brücke, or the Bridge. This group arose around 1905 in Dresden. In his portrayal of the Elbe River in Dresden, in this painting from the Eskenazi Museum's collection, we see the stylistic hallmarks of the expressionist style, including a non-naturalistic, even aggressive palette, heavily applied brushwork, and an extreme simplification of form. The expressionists' two favorite subjects, the urban cityscape and idyllic scenes of nature, come together in this composition. By the end of the 1920s, Kirchner had become one of the most highly regarded German artists of his day, His work was avidly collected by the country's leading art museums, as evidenced by the photograph from Berlin. But less than a decade after this photograph was taken, Kirchner, then living in Davos, Switzerland, took his own life, convinced that the Nazi regime was pursuing him. Though his action was extreme, Kirchner was right to be concerned. In 1937, the year before his suicide, over 600 of his paintings were removed by the regime from German museums, and many were displayed in a spectacular propaganda exhibition known as Degenerate Art, or in German, Entartete Kunst. So I mentioned this exhibition several times already in my talk last week, and I'll discuss it in more detail later tonight. First, I want to talk about Nazism and modernism. The National Socialist Party had a complicated relationship with modernist art and architecture. Certain stylistic elements common in modernist art, including montage and streamlined form, were adopted by the designers of Nazi propaganda posters and by filmmakers such as Leni Riefenstahl, who directed The Triumph of the Will and Olympia, two of Nazi Germany's most notorious propaganda films. Even the installation of the Degenerate Art Exhibition, which condemned modern art, took design cues from the first International Dada Fair of 1920. And I'm showing you photographs of both exhibitions here so you can compare the rather chaotic installation design. So in 1920, the Dada Fair exhibition was mounted by artists of the Berlin Dada movement, which was known for its pacifism and its leftist politics. So about as far removed from Nazism as you can imagine. And of course that makes it quite interesting that the Nazis then turned to Dada for some of their own design choices. But in the realm of the fine arts, in painting and sculpture, modernism was barely tolerated. Although some Nazi officials personally liked German Expressionism, they had to be circumspect about their taste. Meanwhile, the paintings and sculptures produced by artists sanctioned by the Reich, such as the one on your screen, harken back to German Romanticism, to 19th century genre painting, and to the sculpture of classical antiquity. There were several reasons for the Nazi antipathy to modern art. Contrary to popular belief, it generally had little to do with Hitler's failed application to art school. A more likely reason was articulated by the American art critic Clement Greenberg in his 1939 article, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, in which he described the bad art of Nazi Germany, along with similar examples from Mussolini's Italy and Stalin's Russia, as kitsch. That is, as simple, sentimental, and certainly non-modernist art understood and appreciated primarily by the unsophisticated masses. The encouragement of kitsch, Greenberg wrote, is one of the inexpensive ways in which totalitarian regimes seek to ingratiate themselves with their subjects. Yet the promotion of kitsch didn't necessarily have to go hand in hand with the spectacular and sustained defamation of modernism that defined Nazi cultural policy. Clearly, something else was going on. And that something, I argue, was anti-Semitism. And further, of all the different modernist styles that emerged in the early 20th century, it was, somewhat surprisingly, German Expressionism that became most closely conflated with Jews in the eyes and the ideology of the Third Reich. So as we saw in last week's session, the organizers of the Degenerate Art Exhibition specifically chose to reproduce the work of a German Jewish artist, Otto Franlich, on the cover of their exhibition pamphlet. But few of the canonical expressionists, whose names we are most familiar with today, and whose work bore the brunt of Nazi anti-modernist antipathy, artists such as Kirchner, Kandinsky, or Franz Marc, were Jewish. Yet quite a few of their promoters, those who collected, exhibited, and sold their work, were. These ranged from relatively modest collectors such as Ernst Levy, who we learned about last week, to major art dealers such as Herwart Walden, whose Berlin gallery, Der Sturm, hosted some of the first major exhibitions devoted to Expressionism prior to World War I. Walden also published a periodical called Der Sturm, and this further widened the audience for German modern art through its illustrations and reproductions. Obviously, many non-Jews also collected and promoted the work of the German Expressionists, but the Nazis latched onto a perceived Jewish affinity for the style and incorporated this into their propaganda, which of course drew heavily from existing anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish cultural and economic domination. Condemning German Expressionism as Jewish or as controlled by Jews allowed the Nazis also to further discredit the Weimar Republic, the German democratic government in place between 1918 and 1933. It was during the Weimar period, after all, that Expressionism had gained widespread acceptance among the country's cultural elite, an elite described by the Nazis as Jewish. Now, one might assume that explicitly political or anti-fascist art, such as the photomontages of John Hartfield, seen here, would be the primary target of the Nazis. And while they certainly disliked and denounced such work, it was Expressionism that figured most visibly into their propaganda and which consequently became an object of sustained attention abroad. One of the first actions taken by the Nazis in the cultural realm was the dismissal of modernist artists from teaching positions at German art schools and of museum directors and curators known to be sympathetic to modernism. A requirement that artists become members of the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts in order to exhibit or sell their work or to secure a teaching position effectively marginalized Jewish artists as well as artists perceived as politically opposed to National Socialism. Those developments left many German modernist artists with no choice but to emigrate. Initially, many went to Paris or Prague, both of which were relatively nearby and already hosted German-speaking expatriate communities. But some, if they could obtain a visa, chose to go further afield, especially to the United States. This was particularly true of artists who had taught at the Bauhaus, which was Weimar Germany's most experimental art school. Its founder, the architect Walter Gropius, established a new career at Harvard, while the photographer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy became director of a new design school, initially known as the New Bauhaus in Chicago. These artists seem to have adapted well to their new lives in American academia. But for many other emigres, the trauma of dislocation took a heavy toll. We'll take a look now at one of those exiled artists, George Grosz, and consider how his career and his American reception were impacted by his experience of cultural displacement. George Grosz rose to prominence in the 1920s thanks to his politically oriented work that caricatured the human weaknesses and governmental greed he saw around him. The painting shown here, Eclipse of the Sun, targets military and political corruption in Weimar Germany, as well as the indifference of the country's ordinary citizens. As a staunch anti-fascist, it was probably lucky that he happened to be outside of Germany when the Nazis came to power in 1933. At the time, he was in New York, where he had accepted a teaching position at the Art Students League in 1932. With Hitler in power, he could not have safely returned to Germany even if he wanted to, so his status shifted from that of visiting professor to exile. Although American culture had long fascinated Grosz, he struggled personally and artistically once he found himself a permanent resident here. Although the US in the 1930s was in the midst of the Depression and subject to political extremism at both ends of the spectrum, it offered a far more stable environment than Weimar Germany, which was ravaged by the aftermath of World War I, by political unrest, and by economic troubles. As a political satirist, however, Grosz had thrived artistically in that environment, and in the US, he found he had less to protest against. Or perhaps he simply thought it unwise, as an émigré, to critique the distasteful aspects of American society, such as its entrenched racial inequality. In the US, he painted inoffensive landscapes and city scenes for public consumption, such as a scene of New York, leading his American patrons to identify a decline in Gross's American oeuvre. One of them lamented that Gross's hot, quick fighting spirit found no echo in the cool breath of America. He might have felt differently if he had seen the anti-Nazi works that Gross continued to produce during this time, one of which is pictured here. Yet, museums and galleries were reticent to show these anti-Nazi works, finding them far too disturbing and possibly controversial. For example, when discussing a possible exhibition of Gross's work in 1935, Charles Kuhn, the director of Harvard's Germanic Museum, refused to show anything that could be interpreted as anti-Nazi because he didn't want the museum to be seen taking sides. So in addition to explicitly anti-Nazi work, Gross also produced paintings that reveal the psychological trauma he experienced as an exile. This body of work includes his watercolor, Death Beckons, now in the Eskenazi's collection. This composition may reference the worsening situation in Germany, as well as his own depressed mental state. Gross probably painted Death Beckons in 1937, the year that the Nazis' actions towards modern art became particularly belligerent. The macabre portrayal of a skeleton grinning and beckoning to us with a bony finger alludes to the death of modernism and free artistic expression in Germany under the Third Reich. In this work, Gross borrows from the medieval genre known as the Dance of Death, which was meant to remind viewers of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. And such imagery was especially popular in Germany and Northern Europe in the late Middle Ages. And Gross was not the only modern German artist to find this historical imagery useful for expressing his feelings of despair. The German Jewish artist Felix Nussbaum, who lived in hiding in Brussels from 1940 to 1944, and is best known for his self-portrait with Jewish identity card, painted Dance of Death imagery with greater and greater frequency as his situation became more dire. The anti-Nazi and exile-themed works that Gross produced in the US are just as psychologically, politically, and artistically compelling as anything he had painted during the troubled Weimar years. However, when Gross received a solo exhibition devoted to his recent work at MoMA in 1941, the show focused on beach landscapes, on scenes of New York City, and on portraits, a selection of work calculated to convince viewers that the artist was becoming a well-adjusted American. At a time when so many Americans opposed any expansion to the country's immigration quotas, it wasn't seen as wise to highlight the difficulties immigrants faced in this country. So MoMA's Gross exhibition supported a narrative that immigrants easily and productively assimilated into American culture. Returning now to Germany, the mid-1930s saw an intensification of propaganda activity aimed at forms of modernism seen to be non-German and degenerate. Degenerate was a term borrowed from biological discourse and popularized in the field of racial science, a pseudoscience which sought to establish the superiority of the, quote, Aryan race. The Nazis applied the term degenerate to artistic forms they saw as corrupted by the influence of Jews and other non-Aryans. For example, they described jazz, a musical form associated with African Americans, as degenerate as well. In 1937, the Reich Ministry of Propaganda staged the notorious Degenerate Art Exhibition. The exhibition served as a simultaneous attack on modernist artists, on Jews, and on the culture of the Weimar Republic. It opened on July 19, 1937, in the Archaeological Institute adjacent to the Hofgarten in central Munich. Across the street was the imposing facade of the Haus der Deutschen Kunst, or House of German Art, a temple-like gallery constructed in 1934. The day prior to the opening of Degenerate Art, the Great German Art Exhibition opened in the Haus der Deutschen Kunst, showcasing Nazi-approved art. and great German art exhibitions would be an annual feature of Nazi Germany's cultural calendar all the way through 1944. So I'm showing you here two installation shots of the two different exhibitions. As you can see from these photographs, the approach could not have been more different in the two opposing exhibitions. And of course, this was the point. Before I move on, in the photograph of the Great German Art Exhibition, note the heroic portrait of Hitler and the placement of the sculptures so that they actually appear to be making a Heil Hitler salute towards the painting. So the photograph itself becomes a form of propaganda. Now, the Degenerate Art Exhibition was intended, as its title indicated, to convince viewers that modern art, especially its German varieties, was unhealthy and un-German, and that its embrace by German museums in the 20s was a travesty. The galleries of the Archaeological Institute were stocked with over 600 works of art recently removed from German museum collections under the orders of the Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Not only were the works accompanied by racist and anti-Semitic slogans on the walls, but each was labeled with the price paid by the museum from which it had been removed. Because many of these works had been purchased by museums during the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, the prices looked much higher than they really were. After the show closed in Munich, a smaller version traveled to other cities throughout the Reich, including Berlin, Düsseldorf, Leipzig, and Salzburg. Over 2 million people attended, making it the most attended art exhibition of the 20th century. Now let's look at one of the works included in the show, Emile Nolda's Nudes and Eunuch, Keeper of the Harem, which has been in the Eskenazi Museum's collection since 1976. In the photograph, we see the painting, I've circled it, at the opening ceremony for the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And this was printed in the Nazi propaganda newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter. A few words about Emile Nolda. He was briefly affiliated with the German expressionist group Brücke around 1906, although he was a full generation older than most of the expressionists. He developed an individualistic style characterized by loose, rough brushwork and vivid colors. We can see all of this in our painting. Nolda was intensely interested in non-Western cultures, even joining an ethnographic expedition to the South Pacific in 1913. But at the same time, he subscribed to the concept of racial purity that shaped so much of Nazi ideology. In fact, he joined the newly formed National Socialist Party in the early 1920s, long before it would have been professionally expedient for him to do so. Yet, despite his party affiliation and the fact that several high-ranking Nazi officials indeed found his work compelling, Nolda found himself targeted by the party's anti-modern art campaign. No doubt this was due to the fact that his work had been widely admired in Weimar, Germany, and was acquired at that time by all the major German art museums. The Eskenazi's painting, for example, was acquired by the Städtisches or Moritzburg Museum in Halle, a city in Eastern Germany, in 1925. I'm showing here a photo of the museum housed in a former castle on the occasion of a major Nolda show they mounted in 2013. And at this time, we lent the painting to them for that exhibition. At the time of the Degenerate Art Campaign, approximately 1,000 of Nolda's works were removed from the German museums, including the one in Halle. And it's ironic, given Nolda's adherence to notions of racial purity, that the Eskenazi painting, let's go back to that, this painting ostensibly depicting non-Western figures in a harem was displayed in the Degenerate Art Exhibition alongside wall texts that decried the corrupting influence of Jews and non-Aryan races on German art. So although 600 or so works were included in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, about 21,000 works in total were removed from the state-administered museums in 1937 and continuing into 1938. Most of these works were placed in storage, and from there many were sold abroad. The works considered most saleable consisted of roughly 800 paintings and sculptures and 3,500 works on paper. These were transferred to Schloss Niederschönhausen near Berlin, which served as a storage facility. And I'm showing you a photograph here. In the photo, I've circled two sculptures by Wilhelm Lembruck, one of the pioneering expressionist sculptors of the World War I era. Both of the circled works are casts of his 1913 to 14 sculpture, Head of a Girl Turning. One of the casts was removed from a museum in Dresden, and the other from the Landesmuseum in Hanover. The cast from Hanover, we believe, is the one now in the Eskenazi Museum's collection, and we'll look at it again a little later in the presentation. Meanwhile, the works confiscated from museums, along with notes about their fates, were recorded in 1942 in this typed inventory. Just a few copies of this exist physically, but it has been digitized by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which greatly facilitates research into this area. The inventory is organized by city, museum, and artist. I'm showing you here the page on which our Nolda painting appears. Again, that is circled in red. We see that it was sold for $200 to someone named Wielstrup. Now, this was actually Nolda's brother-in-law, who worked as an art dealer in Denmark and arranged with the Reich authorities to buy back quite a few of Nolda's paintings. But most of the so-called degenerate works were sold through 4 German art dealers who were authorized by the Reich to handle sales of degenerate art to clients abroad. And this served the dual purpose of removing this art from Germany while also bringing in valuable foreign currency. Before I move on, I want to point out that you can learn more about the works confiscated through the Degenerate Art Campaign through a database created by the Freie Universität in Berlin. That database is searchable in both German and English, and I've asked Aaron to put a link to the database in the chat. So, reactions to the degenerate art show abroad were largely expressions of outrage and condemnation of Nazi Germany's extreme artistic censorship. And this ultimately led to a reappraisal of German art in some of the Allied countries. It's important to note that while the Expressionists have been canonized in German museums during the 1920s, their work had been less well regarded outside of Germany. In English-speaking countries especially, a widespread preference for French art and a generally more conservative artistic taste, not to mention World War I, had precluded significant interest or acceptance of German modernism prior to the 1930s. But we'll look now at how the Expressionists' international reputations were impacted by their inclusion in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. I'll be focusing on Britain and the US as case studies, and we'll start with Britain, where a major exhibition intended to counter Nazi artistic propaganda opened 1 year after the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And this took place at the New Burlington Galleries in London in July of 1938. So consisting of 269 works by 64 artists, this show, simply titled 20th Century German Art, was the largest exhibition of German modernism ever staged in England up to that point. The New Burlington Galleries was perhaps London's most avant-garde exhibition space. It had recently mounted a major show devoted to surrealism, for example. So the venue itself was sure to bring the German art exhibition notoriety, as was its list of celebrity sponsors, including the art historian Kenneth Clark, the architect Le Corbusier, and the artist Pablo Picasso. At the time the show was mounted, Great Britain was still maintaining a policy of neutrality and appeasement vis-a-vis Nazi Germany. So this might explain the exhibition organizers' strange insistence that the show was not political. Yet, as art critics in the British press pointed out, the exhibition, focusing on the artists targeted in the Degenerate Art show, was blatantly a political statement. And in fact, the exhibition sought specifically to counter the Nazis' argument that the Expressionists were un-German by advancing a nationalistic interpretation of its own. In the exhibition catalog, we read the following. It is to be observed that the most characteristic type of modern German art demands and has received a special name, Expressionism, and that this type of art is in essential conformity with the historical tradition of German art, the art of Cranach, Altdorfer, and Grunewald. This tactic of comparing German Expressionism to historical German precedents would become a prevalent feature of wartime discussions of Nazi artistic propaganda, and was taken up in the United States as well. In addition to emphasizing the Germanness of German Expressionism and thus turning Nazi propaganda on its head, such rhetoric primed English-speaking audiences to appreciate Expressionism for its aesthetic merits by comparing it to the works of admired old masters. Yet, cultivating a market for German Expressionism in Great Britain proved difficult. British critics were by and large skeptical of the artistic quality of the works they encountered at the New Burlington galleries. A review in the journal Connoisseur conveyed a real antipathy for German Expressionism, and perhaps for modernist visual vocabularies in general, equating such artistic license with moral license, as we read in this excerpt from the review. The reviewer says, "In the wild smears that affright the air in the exhibition, there is little evidence of anything but unbridled license. The exhibition, we are told, follows the stages which correspond to those generally recognized as post-impressionism, cubism, and surrealism, and that type of art claimed to be essentially German, Expressionism. But we would like to know under which flag served Franz Marc, the painter of Blue Horses and the Yellow Cow, which seems to us in the same category as the music hall singers, Pink Snakes and Green Mice. The shortcomings of the same artist's Long Yellow Horse are apologized for in its very title. Beckmann's huge allegorical triptych, Temptation, is inept, incoherent, and ineffectual." So quite the review. I've uncovered no other British exhibitions devoted to German modernism during the war years, with one exception. An exhibition titled Mid-European Art was held in 1944 in the city of Leicester, which was home to a community of German Jewish exiles, including the collector Tekla Hess, who sold several German Expressionist works to the city's art museum that year. Mid-European Art was organized under the auspices of Leicester's branch of the Free German League of Culture. And although all 62 of the works on view were by artists who were either German by birth or affiliated with German Expressionism, the exhibition pamphlet avoided reference to Germanness whenever possible. And of course, you can see this right away in the exhibition's title. Given the bombing of London by the Luftwaffe and the internment of many German refugees in England as enemy aliens, it is unsurprising that the German emigres who organized this show downplayed the artists' German identities. So the path that the New Burlington galleries had embarked upon in using German Expressionism to condemn Nazi propaganda would instead be followed in the United States, to which we'll now turn our attention. American audiences proved much more receptive to modern German art in the late 1930s, despite their historical distaste for German art. In the United States, anything German, including art, had become suspect in 1917 when American entry into World War I was accompanied by a massive propaganda campaign against Germany. In the 1920s, a few art dealers and collectors attempted to encourage a market for modern German art in the US, but it wasn't easy. The first American exhibition devoted to German modernism was held in 1923 at the Anderson Galleries in New York. The reviews ranged from lukewarm at best to hostile at worst. It didn't help that, as in Britain, modernism in general was viewed with skepticism by many Americans, including art critics. It wasn't until 1929 that a museum devoted to modern art opened in the United States. Germany itself was a full decade ahead of the US in this regard, as the modern wing of Berlin's National Gallery had opened in 1919. Nevertheless, when the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, opened in New York in 1929, its director, Alfred Barr, tried to make up for lost time by introducing a wide range of modernist art to the public. One of the earliest shows, in 1931, was devoted to German Expressionism. And if you look very carefully, you might see some paintings here that we saw in the first photograph from Berlin, from the National Gallery, which was one of the primary lenders to the MoMA show. So by 1931, American art critics were also becoming more open-minded. The New York Times art critic, Edward Alden Jewell, conceded that some visitors might find themselves a trifle appalled by the artwork's vibrancy and energy, but he urged exhibition goers to give German art a chance. He even went so far as to question French preeminence in the artistic realm, writing that this reviewer is ready to assert that Germany does not stand second, even to the renowned School of Paris. It isn't quite fashionable to make such extreme statements yet, but it is going to be someday. And I would say that Jewell proved to be somewhat prophetic in that assessment. And when German Expressionist paintings and sculptures from the collections of German museums began making their way across the Atlantic in 1937, American audiences were relatively willing to accept them as significant works of art, whether or not they liked them. As one visitor to MoMA's 1938 exhibition devoted to the Bauhaus put it, "I don't expect to enjoy it exactly, but if Hitler has banned it, I think we ought to look at it." So what really transformed American attitudes towards German art was a reverse propaganda campaign of sorts, conceived as a reply to Nazi anti-modernism. The American press reported widely on the Degenerate Art Exhibition and on the removal of modern works from German museums at the behest of the Nazi authorities. Journalists expressed dismay and outrage at the cultural censorship in Germany and the treatment of artists there. And many commentators drew parallels between Germany's disposal of its modern art and the refugee crisis provoked by its human rights violations. In fact, in the midst of contentious debates over immigration in the United States, so-called degenerate art was refashioned as exiled art, which called attention to the humanitarian as well as the cultural crisis in Nazi Germany. For example, when MoMA acquired 5 works of so-called degenerate art in 1939, 2 of which you see here, the press almost universally lauded the museum for saving the exiled paintings and sculptures as if they were people. Nevertheless, it seems that few American commentators in the 1930s grasped how closely tied Nazi anti-modernist actions were to the regime's broader anti-Semitic program. MoMA's own press release announcing this 1939 acquisition stated, "The Nazi opposition to modern art seems to be due to Hitler's personal taste, rather than to any racial or political factors." And it went on to make an unsupported assertion that more cultivated elements in the Nazi Party are very much embarrassed by the degenerate art theories of Der Führer. So MoMA's contention that the Degenerate Art Campaign stemmed from nothing more than Hitler's Philistine taste appears to have been widely accepted, and certainly it made for good propaganda. One of the only media outlets to challenge the museum's efforts to downplay this connection between Nazi anti-modernism and anti-Semitism was the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker. This paper dismissed MoMA's contention that the works of art were not excluded from German museums on racial grounds, and caustically suggested that, had they been thus expelled, there might have been something the matter with them. Another blind spot in the American coverage of the Degenerate Art Campaign concerned the type of art targeted by the Nazis for defamation. Most reporters failed to recognize that German modernism specifically, rather than modernism in general, was the Nazis' prime target. That said, since German expressionist works were in actuality the objects being removed from the museums, those works consequently did receive the greatest amount of attention in the US. And we'll turn now to the role played by emigre art dealers in the US in shaping the market for Expressionism. German and Austrian art dealers, including Karl Nierendorf and Kurt Valentin, began moving to the US around 1936 and opened galleries in New York. Beginning in 1939, they, along with partners at various art museums, began mounting exhibitions devoted to German expressionist painting and sculpture. And these shows helped to build the market for German modernism in the US, while also emphasizing the dealers' opposition to the Third Reich. Kurt Valentin emerged as the most prominent of the emigre dealers promoting Expressionism. You see here a portrait of the dealer by Max Beckmann. After his death in 1954, Valentin was lauded for the role he was perceived to have played in saving works of art that would otherwise have been destroyed by the Nazis. The truth is a bit more complicated. Before his emigration, Valentin had worked at the gallery of Karl Buchholz in Berlin, which specialized in modern German art. In 1936, Valentin arrived in New York, where he established a branch of the Buchholz Gallery. Its inaugural exhibition in March of 1937 focused on modern German sculpture. Now, Valentin had arrived in New York in possession of an export license from the Reich Ministry of Culture. So it is likely that the gallery was initially stocked with works he imported from the Berlin branch of the gallery. But by 1938, at the latest, Valentin also had direct access to works removed from the German museums through the Degenerate Art Campaign. And this is because his colleague in Berlin, Karl Buchholz, was one of the 4 art dealers authorized to sell those works abroad. With the aid of Valentin's export license, they could transfer many of those works to the US. Now, although benefiting on one level from the Degenerate Art Campaign, Valentin used these works to mount several exhibitions that condemned Nazi anti-modernism. The Lembruck sculpture, Head of a Girl Turning, the one now in the Eskenazi's collection, was one of these works, and Valentin included it in his exhibition, Contemporary German Art. That show was developed in collaboration with the Institute of Modern Art in Boston. The show opened in November of 1939, 2 months after the outbreak of war in Europe. Possibly influenced by the Institute's director, James Plout, who would go on to lead the Art Looting Investigation Unit of the Office of Strategic Services, the tone of the exhibition catalog was stridently anti-Nazi. In particular, it condemned the Reich's actions towards what it described as the most significant works of 20th century German artists. So despite the exhibition's title, few of the works in view were truly contemporary. Instead, most were examples of pre-World War I Expressionism, like this sculpture, because that was the target, again, of the Degenerate Art Campaign. 20 of the 74 works on view, including the Lembruck, were accompanied with a note about their former German museum provenances. And this provided viewers with a visceral connection to Nazi censorship. The following year, in 1940, Valentin mounted a smaller German expressionist exhibition called Landmarks in Modern German Art at the Buchholz Gallery in New York. Again, he highlighted the museum provenances of some of the 26 works on view, some of which have been featured also in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. But in a gallery setting, this tactic did more than just illuminate the cultural barbarity of the Nazis. emphasizing that these works were formerly in museum collections also enhanced perceptions of their artistic quality, prestige, and monetary value. Valentine also enlisted Perry Rathbone, a curator at the Detroit Institute of Arts, to write a foreword to the catalog. Rathbone wrote, "The exhibition represents the collective critical judgment of a museum personnel which was remarkable for its foresight and independence in the prompt recognition of the importance of contemporary German art, and was in a position to secure the best and most significant works of the movement." Remember, these are the works on view in the gallery. Valentine and Rathbone presented the works as modernist old masters, emphasizing the Expressionists' canonization in German museums during the 20s and calling attention to the work's affinities with Northern medieval art. That was the same strategy used in the New Burlington exhibition in London, and there was certainly some truth to this claim. For example, note the compositional and stylistic similarities between Beckmann's 1917 painting, Descent from the Cross, and this is a work Valentine exhibited in 1940. The similarities between that and this late 15th century painting by the German artist Michael Wohlgemuth. And that was actually reproduced in a book that Beckmann owned, so it was probably a very direct connection. And the Beckmann painting later entered the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, reestablishing its canonical status, but this time in an American context. At the end of the war, the German emigre art dealer Karl Nierendorf staged an exhibition titled Forbidden Art in the Third Reich, and this was at the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts. The Worcester Daily Telegram's art critic remained unconvinced of the work's artistic merit. He wrote that the gallery walls are dominated by creations that most of us would ban from our homes. Yet, he went on to emphasize that censorship of art was not only unacceptable, but would be un-American. Artistic diversity and freedom of expression, he noted, were fundamental to American culture. And he was far from the only commentator making this kind of a point. Drawing on political discourse that juxtaposed American freedom with Nazi suppression, the rhetoric that developed around German Expressionism ultimately portrayed it as emblematic of democracy and freedom. And this notion remained a powerful idea well into the years of the Cold War. So American reception and interpretation of German modernism was being shaped then against the backdrop of American hostilities with the Soviet Union, where a similar rhetoric was in place. Yet while a narrative equating Expressionism and democracy prevailed, the sympathies of some Expressionist artists with the Nazi regime were conveniently ignored. This narrative no longer holds up today, but its legacy continues to shape our perceptions of Expressionism and the popular view of the Degenerate Art Campaign. An artist like Emile Nolda, for example, has been viewed as so integral to the modernist canon, and his work has been so equated with cultural freedom, thanks to his defamation by the Nazis, that the art world is only today beginning to come to terms with the fact that he himself was a member of the Nazi Party. But the study of degenerate art and the cultural policies of the Third Reich is not unlike the study of looted art. As researchers delve deeper into archives and as more resources become available online, our understanding of the role of art within World War II history, both in the Third Reich and in the Allied nations, becomes ever more nuanced, complicated, and expansive. Next week, we'll continue our exploration into the nuances and consequences of Nazi anti-modernism by examining the lives and careers of several major European art dealers who immigrated to the United States in the 1930s. Tonight, I introduced you to Kurt Valentine and Karl Nierendorf. Next week, we'll look at how they and others aided exiled artists, promoted emerging American artists, and helped American art museums, including the Eskenazi, build their collections in the mid-20th century. I want to thank you all again for being here for this talk this evening. And at this point, I'd be happy to answer some of the questions that you may have been putting into the chat, and I believe Erin will help to moderate that.
Thank you, Jenny. This was wonderful. I hope you all have enjoyed learning more. We also would like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for supporting this event, and would like to note that if you are interested in supporting any of our programs, you can find more information on our website. And that is all we have for you. I